Sugar and Spikes is a science-backed and semi-sarcastic mental health podcast for a new type of business leader. Mental health concerns are occasionally addressed, but this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat any condition, mental, physical, metaphysical, or otherwise. That's a job for your doctor or therapist, not a podcast. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get on with the show.
Welcome back to another kind of special episode of Sugar and Spikes. This is a part of the interim series that is happening between season 2 and season 3. The reason that we're doing this is because Sugar and Spice has been going for a couple of years, and Tammy and myself have really, fought to keep up with the releasing an episode every week. Rain or shine, essentially, with the exception of a few major life events. And she and I were talking, and we both really just wanted a little bit of a break, but also, something didn't sit right with me in terms of letting it go for a month. Maybe that's because I'm a little bit of a control freak. Maybe that's because I don't know. It didn't feel right. So I spent some time thinking about how to do this, how to give myself and Tammy the little bit of break that we need, and how to make sure that there's still content coming out so you guys know we still exist, and that we're definitely coming back in full force pretty soon. If this is your first time listening, then if that intro didn't tip you off, this is going to be a little different. But definitely check out some of the episodes from season 2 or even season 1. They're really great conversations between myself and Tammy, who is a licensed psychologist. And if you don't know who I am, if you're brand spanking new, welcome to the world of Sugar and Spikes. I'm Des. I'm a serial content creator. What I do day in and day out for both, my full-time job and kind of these passion projects like Sugar and Spikes is I make really complicated things interesting and easy to understand. So let's get on with this episode. I'm pretty excited about this. It's gonna be a bit more authentic and maybe a little more raw than I think I was expecting, but I think in the unexpected, that's where, those gems and the magic happens. So to kick this off, I wanted to really just talk about this idea of reflecting on progress and acknowledging the mistakes. I think so often we're kind of quick to write off mistakes as, oh, that's just a lesson learned and that had to happen so I could get here, but we really don't reflect on what does that mean, really kind of dig into the things that were mistakes. And I know personally for me it's hard to say, well, that was a mistake on a personal level, in terms of I'm quick to say, oh, that was a mistake and here's what I learned, you know but really kind of processing why it happened and what that looks like and knowing how to apply it for future. I think there are some different levels, and being okay. I think what I'm getting at is this idea of being okay with not being perfect and letting that be enough before we start to apply kind of the lessons learned. Because the three kind of mistakes that I've made throughout the podcast are things that have kind of eaten away a little bit at me, and definitely kind of affected how I've shown up on the podcast and how I've treated the podcast, and things where it took time to be able to say, you know what, it was a mistake and that's okay. You can't redo it. So what can we learn and move on? So there's a difference between just blazing forward and really acknowledging any emotional stuff that comes with making mistakes, because for overachievers, for people that grew up, really kind of shooting for the stars and stuff like that, we're not used to making mistakes. We're used to things coming naturally. So it's it's understandable that we have these awkward relationships with the idea of mistakes. So to kind of just kick it off, the the first thing that I've always kind of gone back in my mind and said, God, I wish I could have done this differently, is this idea of a launch strategy for a podcast. Um, you know, I started this podcast not necessarily on a whim. It was something that I wanted to do, but I'm very much a leap before I look kind of girl. When it comes to anything entrepreneurial or side hustle ish, I'm very much of a we'll figure it out um person, because I know for a fact that I get caught in my head. So I think I've overcorrected in a sense. Before I was very much, I would research and research and research and research and come up with all these plans, make sure everything was perfect. And then with the podcast, I did a complete turn and was just like, let's record, let's put it out. I don't care. We'll figure it out from there, which is great. Like, that got this podcast going. And I don't think it would have happened um any other way given where I was at the time. But if I were to go back, if I were to work with someone else around starting a podcast, then I would, talk about this idea of a launch strategy and having a few episodes ready for release so people could listen and get a feel for you, and having your social media kind of settled in this identity, and having some sort of strategy beyond, well, we release an episode every week, or we release an episode every other week. I'd have some sort of working plan beyond, well, let's see what happens this week, which, it's hard because that methodology has served us well. I mean, if it didn't work, we wouldn't be here 2 years later, over 100 episodes later. If it didn't work, Sure and Twix wouldn't be where it is. But I think that we could be further quicker if there had been a launch strategy. And so there's definitely had to be some work around letting go of, well, I messed up. No, I mean, it's a lesson learned. I did the best I could. I think that's the thing with learning things. Like, no one's like, I'm gonna screw up today. Like, we're all doing the best we can with the knowledge that we have. So that would be kind of the first mistake and thing that has been hard to let go of, how it's influenced the podcast. The second one would be this idea of missing weeks. As a podcaster, there's definitely an idea, and I think it shows up very clearly in the idea in this interim kind of series of, you don't miss weeks. Like, your audience wants to know you're there. Like, it has to be a regular cadence, and that's super important. And when your content and your passion project is, you know, not your full-time job, and when you have life happening, then the chances of missing a week, missing a blog post, missing something are pretty significant. Like, dare I say it, it's going to happen at some point or another. But I got really down on myself when we would miss weeks, and I put a lot of value on it. And I think that that may have done more harm than good, because when it came time to record the next episodes, I wasn't focused on, well, what can I learn from this larger situation? But, oh my God, we have to get something out right now, so we have something in this next week. Versus, well, what is the bigger lesson here? It's really easy to get caught up in like these micro moments and spinning on a wheel and not kind of seeing the forest for the trees. Whereas, Tammy and I probably missed a handful of weeks over the course of the last couple of years, and it we didn't really step back and think, well, how do we handle the podcast as a project that's bigger and longer, and how do we kind of manage it with a bigger lens? It was, no, we have to record right now because we missed last week, so let's get this done. Always working in a very like just in time mindset. And when it comes to content that can be evergreen, when it comes to things that aren't necessarily time sensitive, bulk batching and, having that flexibility around content release is one of the biggest assets you have. And like, I think it's one of those things where maybe for some people, like I'm a stove toucher. Like one of my base ideas of the world is there are two types of people. There are stove touchers and not stove touchers, which is, when you're a kid, your mom tells you to not touch the stove because it's hot, and you're either going to listen to your mom and say, "Okay, cool, I'm not going to touch the stove," or you're going to touch the stove and be like, "Oh shit, that's hot." I'm a stove toucher. So as much as I heard people being like, batch your content, I wanted to be like, no, I'm gonna do it in flow. It's gonna be fabulous. That didn't work. And most of the time it's not going to work because best laid plans don't work. Um so that was another one of those mistakes. It's really been a process. Like, I think that's the other thing is we think that things need to click like step by step, and growth and personal and professional development is this continued process, in small learnings that build to larger realizations. I don't think that this idea of an interim session and taking on a solo kind of perspective for a little bit would have come to me if it weren't for kind of those micro mistakes and micro lessons that I had learned throughout the years. Because I'll tell you, it like I spent the last couple of months being like, I want to take time off. We all like Tammy and I need some time off, but I don't want to give up a month. Like I don't just want to disappear. How do I do this? How do I do this? And just feeling very stuck. And then it was like a light bulb where, oh, it doesn't have to be all or nothing, and I think that that's the case where we kind of get stuck and spin our wheels, is this idea of, you know, it's all or nothing, and it's not. So taking time to look at lessons throughout the moment as they're happening can really save you a lot of stress. Finally, the third mistake that I made that I definitely carried with me, and needed to take time to process and move forward, was not having boundaries around guests. And here's what I mean by that. Last year, life got crazy, absolutely crazy. And we had some guests scheduled. And what happened was I showed up, like I did the business professional piece where I showed up because things were booked, and that's what you do. Interviews are booked, and that's that. And, you don't cancel, and the world keeps moving no matter what's going on, right? But I wasn't there. Like, I can own it now, and maybe that's like the point of this episode, is some therapeutic process. But I really wasn't mentally or emotionally present for some guests that I had on, and that didn't feel great. So it's navigating, and it's this continuous navigation of what is going on with my larger life versus what is going on with this passion project, this side hustle, with other things that need my attention and really matter to me. Um, and, you know, realizing that it's not going to be perfect, and sometimes embracing the idea of we're all doing the best we can. Like, I did spend a lot of time feeling guilty about the way I showed up for those guests, and, in talking with Tammy about it, this idea of, and that was what I could do in terms of honoring them at that time, if that makes sense. So I think what I'm getting at is when it comes down to content creation, is it ties back to kind of scheduling and batch creating and being ready for, the fires to go down and things to hit the fan, of not feeling like you have to show up even when things are crazy. Um and acknowledging that if other people are involved, there is a level of professionalism that is kind of called upon. I don't care if it's a side hustle. Sometimes you need to put things aside and do it. And if it's like a level 10 in case of emergency situation, then it's that level of authenticity and saying, maybe today is not the best. I think a clear example is in season 1 when I interviewed Lorna Liz and I told her straight up, like, I'm not sure what state I'm in. I'm sorry if this is an awkward interview. I've been traveling nonstop and haven't slept in days because of diverted travel, and just owning that. I think authenticity can kind of get you out of a lot of really uncomfortable situations. I think in terms of boundaries and everything, it's this interesting dialectic of authenticity and having authenticity and saying, this isn't the best because of X, Y, and Z. It gives you professional boundaries. It gives you professional boundaries while having this sort of human connection. So, I mean, there's no one way to manage when things go absolutely haywire and you feel like you may not be able to bring your best self to an interview or to a product launch or to, you know, writing something, and things need to get done. So, how it comes down to pre planning and how do you give space for the likelihood that things are going to happen. Um, and just looking back on what you've been doing like the last year, like if you've been doing this for a while, what have you been doing? How, or maybe if you haven't been making content, maybe if you're like new to the entrepreneur space, if this is all new to you, like look at the times when you've been super busy and have had to like multitask. How have you gotten through it before? What have been signs that maybe it's been too much, and how have you navigated those moments and creating some sort of plan? That's really what I wish I would have done throughout these last couple of years, is been more planful so that I could have been more flexible. Um, but ultimately, in terms of reflecting and stuff, these three mistakes, these three situations that weren't great, they could have eaten away. They could have stopped me from showing up. They could have really diverted the podcast and made it hard to, you know, come back from it. But I think the important thing to remember when it comes to mistakes is, you know, it's only detrimental if you let it be, and to just keep pushing forward. I think what has gotten Sugar and Spikes through all of these mistakes, and God, so many more mistakes, is the fact that we just keep going and we keep showing up, and it's that consistency and authenticity that has let Tammy and myself build a brand that people can connect with. So when you do hit a milestone, when you do hit time point to reflect, give space for the mistakes, honor them, like acknowledge what has happened, see what you can learn from them, and know that they don't define the rest of everything you've done, because for every mistake there have been 5 other wins that come from that. So that's what I got for this week. The more kind of normal Sugar and Spikes will be back not next week but the week after. Um and if you like what Sugar and Spikes is all about, go ahead and leave us a review on iTunes. It would mean the world to us. If you're not subscribed, make sure you're subscribed. Season 3 is going to be amazing. We have some really cool things coming up. And make sure you're following along on social media, Sugar and Spikes Pod on Instagram, or if you want to follow me, through the day-to-day fun. I'm across all of the socials, be it Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all that. Des WMSMBA, so DEZ WMSMBA. So the three new things you can do after this: subscribe, leave us a review, follow along. And like I said, I'll be back next week for another special interim episode, and season 3 starts back up pretty soon. Talk to you later. Bye.